a silence that spoke louder than words. The rain didn't pour that day, but the sky felt heavy, not with clouds, but with memory. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in a corner of his minimalist Los Angeles home, surrounded by warm wood and gentle shadows, his fingers curled around a worn photograph. It was an old press photo. He and Sandra, arms flung around each other, frozen in that iconic laughter from the Speed premiere nearly 30 years ago. The photo had faded, but the emotion hadn't. His jaw was tight, not from sadness, not from joy, from something in between, a truth he had carried far too long. Hollywood was a place that rarely allowed anything pure to survive. Fame corroded authenticity, and time made sincerity feel like a luxury no one could afford. But in the chaos, there had been Sandra. From the very first table read, she had been different. She didn't care about the spotlight. She didn't push. She didn't pretend. And maybe that's why Keanu never told the world what he knew, because sometimes the most precious truth deserved to remain untouched by noise. But today was different. For the first time in years, Keanu had accepted a podcast interview that millions had requested, but never believed would happen. The host was someone discreet, thoughtful, known for bringing out the most hidden corners of the soul. But what no one knew was that Keanu wasn't going there to talk about his career. He wasn't going to promote anything. He wasn't even going to speak as an actor. He was going to speak as a man who owed the world one final story. And that story was Sandra. The car ride to the studio was quiet. No entourage, no makeup, no agent. Just Keanu and his driver, an ex-Marine named Leo, who understood silence better than most. As the city blurred past the tinted glass, Keanu stared out, his reflection mingling with the sun-streaked skyline. He remembered the first time he and Sandra laughed off-screen. It wasn't even during a scene. It was in the middle of a lighting delay. They had sat on the curb sharing a sad little vending machine sandwich, and Sandra had said, "Do you ever feel like Hollywood's just a waiting room for your soul?" Keanu hadn't answered then, but today that line echoed louder than ever. When he arrived, the crew kept their distance, respecting the mood that clung to him. Cameras were being tested, microphones adjusted, yet there was a palpable hush, as if everyone sensed something bigger was about to unfold. Something that didn't belong to scripts or trailers, but to real life. And when the red light blinked on, and the host welcomed him with a calm voice and a knowing nod, Keanu didn't smile. He looked straight into the lens and said, "Before we begin, I want to tell you a story, a real one, about someone who changed the way I see the world. This is about Sandra Bullock, and it's a truth I think the world deserves to know, even if it took me a lifetime to say it." Rewind the clock. Keanu had just finished Little Buddha and was in a strange headspace. Critics didn't know what to make of him. Studios saw him as a maybe, and beneath the quiet exterior was a man battling grief, confusion, and identity. He had walked away from roles that could have made him richer, but something in his soul didn't want fame. He wanted meaning. Then came Speed. The script was intense, the action insane. But what caught Keanu's attention was the female lead, not the character, the actress being considered Sandra Bullock. At the time, she wasn't a global name. She had done a few roles, but nothing seismic. Yet when Keanu saw her audition tape, he didn't blink. He didn't ask for a second take. He told the director, "That's her. That's the soul I want next to me in this film." And the moment she walked into rehearsal, it was like watching sunlight enter a cold room. Sandra didn't posture. She didn't flirt. She didn't compete. She just showed up, fully herself. She listened when others spoke. She laughed without hesitation, and she carried a kind of kindness that wasn't loud. It was steady. That first week, Keanu had been quiet, reserved, keeping his inner world locked up as usual. But it was Sandra who broke through, not by prying, but by offering something far rarer: presence. She never asked, "Are you okay?" Instead, she just sat beside him during breaks, tossing him half of her granola bar and joking about how bad their trailer coffee was. And that was the beginning of a silent bond. Hollywood loves its fake romances. The tabloids frothed with theories. Are they dating? Secret couple on set? Chemistry beyond the screen. But behind the scenes, it was something different, deeper. They never crossed the line. Not because they didn't feel it, but because they respected each other too much. Sandra once told him during a night shoot under the freeway lights, "Maybe our story isn't meant to be a romance. Maybe it's something pure." Keanu had nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's the only real thing in a town that sells lies." They finished Speed, and life exploded. Fame, tours, awards. But both of them knew that something had shifted inside them. They kept in touch, gently. Letters, phone calls, occasional dinners when they were in the same city. And then came the moment Keanu had never shared with anyone. He was filming in Vancouver when he got a call that shattered his world. His sister's leukemia had returned. Doctors weren't hopeful. He flew back to Los Angeles immediately, devastated. But when he landed, there was someone waiting at the gate. Not his agent, not his manager, not the studio. Sandra, no cameras, no invitation. She had just heard through a mutual friend and flown in. No words were exchanged. She simply walked up to him, opened her arms, and held him as he broke down in the middle of LAX. He never forgot that. Back in the podcast studio, Keanu's voice cracked slightly as he recounted the moment. "She didn't have to be there," he said, eyes glistening. "But that's who Sandra is. The world sees a movie star. But I saw a healer, a guardian, a light in the dark." The host didn't interrupt. The cameras kept rolling. And somewhere across the globe, millions of viewers would soon hear this story. Not of scandal, not of drama, but of something the world desperately needed. Pure, unconditional friendship. But the story wasn't over. Because what Keanu was about to reveal next would silence Hollywood itself. Something he had kept buried for decades. A decision, a night, a choice that changed everything, and no one ever knew. Until now. The letter she never knew he wrote. It was the kind of letter that never makes it into a drawer. Keanu had written it late one evening in 1998, long after the house had gone still, long after the city noises had faded into the hush of dawn's approach. The ink on the page had run in places, not from a faulty pen, but from something more human. His eyes had stung from everything he hadn't said, and as he folded the paper neatly and tucked it into a worn black notebook, he didn't know it would remain unread for decades. That notebook, containing years of unsent thoughts, letters, fragments, and truths, lived quietly on a shelf behind the piano, nestled between his copy of Marcus Aurelius and an old script from the lake house. It wasn't intended for the world. It wasn't even intended for Sandra, but in it lived the raw, untouched truth about their connection. A truth he had never dared give voice to, until now. Back in the studio, the podcast host sat frozen, his breath caught somewhere between awe and reverence. The room was still, except for the soft hum of the recording equipment and the steady rhythm of Keanu's voice, now thicker, slower, as though each word carried the weight of 100 sleepless nights. "After Speed, we were offered everything," Keanu murmured. "More roles together, romantic films, endorsements. But there was something about us, something we were both scared to break. People assumed we didn't try, that we just stayed friends. But the truth is, I almost told her. I came close once. I wrote a letter. I never sent it." There was no dramatic flourish, no sudden gasp, just truth, plain and shivering. "In that letter, I told Sandra I had fallen for the way she listened, for the way she made everyone feel seen, for the way she didn't let Hollywood change her laughter. I told her, if there was ever a moment where she looked at me and saw something more, even for a second, I'd be ready." He paused, eyes distant, almost as if he could see that very moment again. The quiet candlelight, the sound of the pen scratching paper, the way he folded it with trembling hands. "But I never sent it. I convinced myself it would ruin everything. We had something rare, gentle, sacred. I didn't want to break it. And so the letter stayed hidden." Years passed, careers soared, and yet beneath all the premieres and the interviews and the magazine covers, something remained untouched. a whisper of what could have been. Then came the lake house. Keanu hadn't been sure if he'd say yes to the role. The premise was strange, a time-traveling mailbox. But when he learned Sandra was attached, everything shifted. It had been over a decade since they had acted side by side. But the moment they met on set, it felt as though not a single day had passed. "She smiled at me the same way," Keanu recalled, voice soft. "And for a moment, I thought maybe it wasn't too late." The film was quiet, poetic, woven with longing. And those emotions weren't just written in the script. They lived in every glance between them. What the audience didn't know was that the moments of silence between Keanu and Sandra on screen weren't rehearsed. They weren't blocked. They were real. There was a moment on set, a night shoot near the lake after the cameras had wrapped. Sandra had brought out a thermos of cocoa, offering it to Keanu as they sat under a navy sky dusted with stars. "I sometimes wonder," she had said, not looking at him, "if we've been writing letters to each other all along, just never sending them." He had looked at her then, truly looked, not the way an actor looks at a co-star, but the way a soul looks at the one it has quietly waited for. He wanted to tell her about the letter, about what he'd written all those years ago. But once again, the moment passed. "You see," Keanu said now in the studio, his hand resting gently on the table, "I think fear doesn't always show up as panic or anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as restraint, as politeness, as silence. I was afraid, not of rejection, but of losing the only person who had ever seen me before the fame did." The host didn't dare speak. He knew this wasn't just a story, it was a confession. "And life has a way of moving on," Keanu continued. "We dated others, took different roles, lived separate lives. But she was always there, not physically, but in my choices, in the way I treated others, in the pauses between my words." Sandra had gone on to win awards, to be loved across the world, and through it all, Keanu remained her quiet admirer, never once disrupting the beauty of what they had, because to him it was already perfect in its own quiet way. But fate is strange, because a few years ago, something happened that forced Keanu to open that black notebook again. Something that made the silence too loud to bear. It was a call. And it wasn't about work. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, Keanu received a call from Sandra's assistant. She had tested positive, badly. She was being cared for at home, far from the city, isolated, quiet, and vulnerable. The assistant didn't ask for anything, just wanted him to know. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. He sat at the piano, not playing, just staring. And then he opened the notebook. The letter was still there, the folds worn, the ink faded, but it still carried the same heartbeat. And that night, for the first time, Keanu rewrote it. Not as a confession, but as a prayer. "Dear Sandra," he whispered aloud as he wrote, "if I never get to say this to your face, I want the world to know. You are the finest part of my story, not because of a film, not because of a friendship, but because in a world that demanded masks, you chose to remain human." He never mailed that version either. But something shifted in him that night, and when Sandra recovered, when her voice returned, and she sent him a simple voicemail saying, "Hey you, still standing, coffee sometime?" Keanu knew he didn't need the letter anymore, because love, real love, doesn't always demand words. Sometimes it just asks us to stay. In the studio, the host leaned forward slightly, finally breaking the silence. "So, if she hears this now, today, what would you want her to know?" Keanu smiled gently, the kind of smile that carried years of ache and beauty. "I'd want her to know I never needed a title. Not girlfriend, not partner, not love of my life." He paused. "She was and is the chapter of my soul that I never wanted to end. And whether she ever reads that letter or not, she's already lived in every line." The red light on the camera blinked off. The interview ended. But across the world, as the footage began to circulate, as fans and strangers alike wiped tears from their eyes, one thing became profoundly clear. This wasn't just about Keanu or Sandra. It was about us, about every unsent letter, every unspoken truth, every sacred silence. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones the world almost missed. And Keanu Reeves had finally made sure this one wouldn't be, when she knocked on his door with no warning. There are moments in life that arrive without announcement, moments so raw, so unscripted, that no camera could ever capture their soul. It was a rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind that carried more silence than thunder, when Keanu Reeves heard a knock on his front door. No scheduled visit, no text ahead, just three gentle knocks that reverberated not just through the air, but through years of quiet longing. When he opened the door, there she was, Sandra Bullock. No makeup, no bodyguards, no pretense. Her dark jeans soaked at the hem, hair slightly damp, a knit sweater clinging softly to her frame. But it was her eyes that arrested him. They weren't sad, nor were they bright with joy. They were tired, like someone who had been holding back the weight of unspoken things for far too long. Keanu simply stepped aside, no questions, no hesitation. Because when someone shows up in the middle of a storm, you don't ask why. You just let them in. She entered quietly, as if crossing the threshold into a part of her life she had kept untouched. Keanu closed the door behind her and led her to the couch, both of them moving like old dancers who knew the steps, even if the music had long since faded. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked around the house, familiar, yet filled with new memories. And then her gaze landed on the black notebook, sitting open on the piano bench. The very notebook that had held his letter for all those years. He hadn't meant to leave it open, but maybe on some subconscious level he had. "I couldn't sleep last night," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the gentle patter of rain. "And for some reason, I started thinking about that day in Vancouver, when your sister was sick." Keanu turned, his eyes soft, waiting. "You never told me how you got through that," she said, not as an accusation, but as a whisper of a wound long shared yet never spoken of. Keanu sat beside her, a pause stretching between them, thick with memory. "I didn't," he said. "I just survived, because you showed up." Sandra looked at him then, really looked, and in that moment, something in the air shifted. Not romantic tension, not dramatic revelation, but the kind of quiet recognition that happens when two souls finally drop their armor. "I wasn't planning to come today," she said, her eyes scanning the room again. "I was driving past the old coffee place we used to joke about. You know, the one with the bitter espresso and the broken chairs. And I don't know, something in me just said, go. Like the universe wasn't going to let me keep carrying what I've been carrying." Keanu didn't move. He simply waited, allowing her the space to unfold. "I've been thinking about the choices we never made," she said, her voice steadier now. "The words we never said, and all the versions of our lives that live quietly in the spaces between our films and our fame." There it was, the ache that had followed them both, shadow-like and sacred. "I used to wonder," she continued, "what would have happened if we tried, if we crossed that line, if we'd ruined what we had, or finally become what everyone already believed we were." Keanu's breath caught, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "And then I realized, maybe we were never meant to be lovers, not in the way the world defines it. Maybe we were something else, something that didn't need a label, but I still needed to come here and tell you." She turned fully to face him now, her hands gently clasped. "You were the one constant in my life that never demanded anything, never asked, never pushed. You just stayed, and I don't think I ever said thank you." The words hung in the air like a song unsung for years. Keanu looked at her, and for a moment his eyes shimmered, not with sadness, but with deep, overwhelming peace. "You don't need to thank me," he said, "because in all the chaos of my life, you were the only place that felt like home." And there, in that quiet room filled with forgotten music and open notebooks, the two of them sat. Not as actors, not as icons, but as two people who had loved each other in 1,000 silent ways. The rain outside began to ease, and a soft light spilled through the window. Sandra stood and walked toward the piano, Her fingers grazed the black notebook, and instinctively she reached for it. But just before she opened it, Keanu's hand gently rested on hers. "Not yet," he said, a warm smile playing at his lips. She nodded, understanding more in that single moment than any letter could ever reveal. Some truths weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be lived. They made tea, talked for hours, laughed about their worst movie hairstyles, reminisced about forgotten set pranks, and cried quietly over people they'd lost. But what mattered most was the silence between the words. The comfortable, healing silence that only exists between two souls who have walked parallel paths for a lifetime. When she finally stood to leave, the sun had emerged, golden and soft, casting a glow over everything. At the door, she turned to him one last time. "Do you ever think we missed it?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, I think we just lived it differently." And with that, she was gone. But this time, the door didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like a full circle. Back in the podcast studio weeks later, the footage of Keanu's interview had already gone viral. People were flooding social media not with gossip, but with gratitude, for reminding the world that love is not always loud, that friendship, in its purest form, is sacred, and that some stories don't need a kiss to be real. What no one knew, however, was that Sandra had seen the interview before it aired. Keanu had sent her a private copy, with a note clipped to the front. "I finally found the courage to say what I never did." She watched it alone in her New Orleans home, lights off, hands trembling. And when it ended, she didn't cry. She just sat in the quiet for a long, long time. Then she stood, walked over to her own shelf, and pulled out a notebook of her own, a simple leather-bound journal that had traveled with her for decades. And somewhere, in the middle pages, was a letter. To Keanu. Unsent, unspoken, until now. The journal she hid from everyone. There was something sacred about the way she touched the journal, almost as though it held a living pulse of its own. Sandra Bullock sat alone in her reading nook, curled beneath an old throw blanket, the leather-bound journal resting across her lap like a fragile memory she had never fully unwrapped. Outside, the gentle hum of crickets competed with the occasional rustling of late summer wind, and the room flickered with candlelight. It wasn't nostalgia that drew her to the pages that night. It was reckoning. After watching Keanu's raw confession, something deep inside her had begun to stir, something she had long buried. She had seen his heart laid bare, and it shattered the careful silence she had spent decades cultivating. Her journal wasn't filled with film schedules or industry gossip. It wasn't a diary of red carpets and awards. It was a vault of whispered truths, private sorrows, and one particular letter she had written over 20 years ago, but never sent. A letter addressed to Keanu Reeves. She ran her fingers across the cover, then opened it carefully, past scribbled poetry, bits of gratitude, and dried petals from a bouquet someone once left at her door after a charity gala. And there it was, folded into thirds, yellowed slightly at the corners, her own words frozen in time like an unclaimed gift. She hesitated only for a moment, then gently unfolded the letter and began to read. "Keanu, I don't know if I'll ever send this. I don't know if it even makes sense to put it into words. But I need a place to say this, and maybe someday, it'll find its way to you." As she read, the decades melted away. She was back on the speed set, laughing under harsh lights, her fingers stained with ink from script rewrites, her cheeks flushed from heat and nerves. Back in the cramped trailer where Keanu had made her laugh so hard she spilled coffee on her costume. Back in those fleeting moments when she would catch him staring, not with desire, but with something even more dangerous, understanding. "I think we both know there's something between us," the letter continued, "something neither of us is ready to name. Maybe we're scared to ruin what's already perfect. Maybe we've both been hurt in ways that make silence feel safer. But I need you to know, there are nights I dream about a version of us that isn't dictated by contracts, press tours, or timing. A version where we meet in a world that doesn't demand anything but truth." Her eyes stung. The letter had been a confession, one she had never dared to share. And now, knowing Keanu had written his own version of that same story, she felt the ache of all the years lost to what-ifs. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, her heart pounding, not with regret, but with a profound and unshakable peace. The world had always seen them as star-crossed artists, a cinematic fantasy, but the truth was far more human. Two people who had loved each other, not through the lens of romance, but through something deeper and often overlooked in Hollywood: devotion without condition. A week later, Sandra did something uncharacteristic. She booked a last-minute flight to Los Angeles under a pseudonym, with no assistant, no stylist, no plan. She wore sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat and boarded a red-eye that barely anyone noticed. She wasn't running from anything. She was running towards something she had postponed long enough: the truth. She arrived in LA just past 6 a.m., and the city hadn't fully woken up. The streets shimmered from overnight sprinklers. Cafes were still dragging out chairs, and as she sat in the back of a black SUV, watching the skyline blur past, her fingers trembled slightly over the envelope tucked in her handbag, the letter sealed now, ready to be handed over. She didn't know how he'd react, but she knew the moment demanded honesty. When she reached Keanu's house, she paused at the gate, remembering that last rainy day. The same wooden steps, the same creeping vines, the same quiet gravity pulling her forward. She didn't knock right away. Instead, she stood for a long moment, eyes closed, letting the air settle around her. And then slowly, she raised her hand and knocked. 3 times, just like before. Keanu opened the door, eyes widening in surprise. He wasn't expecting her, and yet somehow he seemed prepared. There was a softness in his expression, a stillness that only comes from someone who has stopped chasing answers and started accepting truths. "Sandra," he said almost reverently, as if the name itself was music. "I didn't come for closure," she began, stepping in. "I came for honesty." He nodded slowly, stepping aside, letting her in. They sat across from each other. No drinks, no distractions, just two souls stripped of performance. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. "This," she said, placing it on the table, "was written in 1999. I was afraid to give it to you then, and maybe I still am, but I think it's time." Keanu stared at the envelope as if it held a ghost. Then he looked back at her, eyes unreadable. "You don't have to read it now," she said. "I just needed you to have it." A long pause, then he spoke. "I have something too," he said, rising slowly and walking toward the piano. He returned moments later with his own notebook. He placed it next to her envelope, 2 pieces of a story long delayed. "Maybe," he said softly, "we were never meant to be a couple. Maybe we were meant to be something even rarer." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like 2 people who remind the world that real love isn't always loud or wrapped in romance. Sometimes it's 2 hearts that just never let go." And with that, the silence between them changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't aching. It was whole. The sun rose fully as they sat there, talking, not about regrets, but about everything they had gained from loving each other gently, quietly, and without agenda. Keanu spoke about his sister, about his grief, and about how Sandra's presence had always been his anchor. Sandra shared stories she had never told anyone, of quiet breakdowns, of masked loneliness behind awards, of how knowing Keanu existed gave her strength even when they hadn't spoken in months. By the time she left, the air felt different. Something unspoken had finally been spoken. Something long buried had been freed. They didn't make promises. They didn't exchange plans. But they knew, more than ever, that their story wasn't over. It was just changing form. The call that changed everything. The seasons had shifted. The leaves had begun their descent, golden and curled at the edges, and the air had taken on that delicate scent of nostalgia, a faint blend of wood smoke, aging time, and memories not yet unpacked. Life in Los Angeles, though constantly buzzing beneath its surface, seemed slower in those moments, as if the city itself was holding its breath for something unseen. It had been months since Sandra had left Keanu's home that morning, leaving behind the sealed envelope and a chapter long overdue. Neither of them had spoken publicly about what had transpired. No statements, no interviews, no leaks. It was a story written for only 2 readers, and the world for once wasn't invited in. But then came the call. Keanu had been in Tokyo, shooting a small indie film that promised no action sequences, no elaborate stunts, just raw emotion and honest silence. The kind of story he gravitated toward more and more in recent years. He was reading through rewrites when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped him cold. Sandra. She rarely called. They usually texted, short check-ins, soft birthday wishes, the occasional article forwarded without comment. But this was different. A call. He stepped outside, the Tokyo air crisp and echoing with distant traffic. "Hey," he said, voice calm but edged with concern. There was a silence on the line. Not the kind filled with hesitation, but one trembling with truth. Then her voice. "Keanu, I need to tell you something, and I didn't want to write it. I needed you to hear it from me." His heart slowed. The city noise dulled around him. He listened. "I read your notebook, every page, every letter. Even the ones you didn't mean for me to read," she said, her voice cracking just slightly, enough to let pain slip through. "And I realized something. I was never scared of loving you. I was scared of not being able to love you the way you deserved." Keanu stood still, absorbing each word like it was the air he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. "I spent so many years trying to be everything to everyone. Hollywood wanted charm, the media wanted perfect. And you never asked for anything. You just stayed, quietly, patiently, even when I pushed you to the background." He closed his eyes, memories cascading. Her laughter on set, the way she looked at him without judgment, the gentle weight of her presence whenever he was falling apart. "I want to try," she said finally, "not because the world wants it, not because of fan fiction or old movie magic, but because you're the only person I've ever trusted enough to be silent with." A long pause. Then in a voice steadier than he expected from himself, Keanu replied, "I wasn't waiting, I was living. But every version of my life, Sandra, you were in it, even the ones I never spoke of." They didn't speak for a few moments, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Two people, separated by oceans and years, standing on the edge of something vast and overdue. She broke the silence. "I'll be in Kyoto tomorrow. There's a little tea house on the Eastern Hill. No press, no cameras, just you and me." He didn't ask questions. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I'll be there." The next day, under a gray sky veined with pink morning light, Keanu walked the narrow stone-paved path that wound through the Kyoto hillside. The tea house was small, tucked between a bamboo grove and a gently flowing stream. No tourists, no distractions. Just the soft rustle of leaves and the smell of roasted tea in the air. She was already there when he arrived, sitting by the window in a simple cream sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. No makeup, no mask, just her. The woman who had lived in the pages of his notebook, in the corners of his memory, in the pauses of his life. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When the tea was poured and the silence had become something sacred, she finally said, "I'm not here to rewrite the past. I'm here to begin from now." Keanu looked at her, eyes clear. "Then let's begin with honesty." And that's what they did. For hours in that quiet tea house beneath the weightless sky, they spoke like two people returning home. Not to a house or a city, but to the version of themselves they'd always tucked away when they were with anyone else. Sandra shared stories of lonely nights surrounded by crowds, of success that felt hollow, of loving him quietly, like a secret too delicate for the world. Keanu opened up about his grief, not just the deaths, but the slow erosion of trust that fame had inflicted. About how Sandra's laughter had always been the one sound that brought him back from the edge. They didn't make promises. They didn't speak of forever. They spoke of mornings, of making space, of seeing each other not as legends or symbols or former co-stars, but as a man and a woman who had walked long enough apart to finally walk together. When they left the tea house, the sun had fully risen, and the bamboo leaves shimmered with dew. They walked side by side, hands not touching, but closer than ever before. The space between them no longer heavy with unsaid words, but light with understanding. That night, Keanu wrote something new in his notebook. He didn't write her a letter. He didn't write a confession. He wrote just one sentence. "Today, she looked at me with the eyes of someone who was finally ready to stay." Back in Los Angeles, the rumors began swirling almost instantly. A blurry photo of them walking in Kyoto. A grainy clip of them laughing near the tea house. The headlines came fast. Reeves and Bullock, finally together? Hollywood's most patient love story? But for the first time, neither of them responded. They didn't owe the world a statement. The story no longer belonged to gossip. It belonged to them. Quietly, honestly, and finally fully lived. The story they never told, but finally lived. It had started as a whisper, barely audible, barely formed. A whisper shared in moments too fragile for fame to touch. Over years, that whisper became a rhythm. Not a declaration, not a confession, but something steady, something lasting. Now it was no longer a secret. It had become a life. Months had passed since their walk through the Kyoto bamboo grove. The world had returned to its chaos. Films were released, red carpets rolled out, headlines flashed and disappeared like sparks on asphalt. But somewhere beneath all the noise, in a space far removed from Hollywood's demands, a different story was being written. Not on paper, not in tabloids, but in quiet routines, in text messages that no longer needed to be timed, in video calls made without reason, in dinners where no cameras waited outside. Keanu and Sandra had not made a public announcement. They hadn't appeared on magazine covers or done joint interviews. They hadn't shared a photo on social media or confirmed anything to reporters. But something had shifted, palpably and permanently. For the first time in decades, they were no longer orbiting each other. They were in each other's gravity. It started with small things. A Saturday morning hike in Griffith Park, grocery shopping in oversized sunglasses, her voice on his voicemail. "Hey, I found that old piano book we laughed about. Want to come mess up Chopin together?" His note on her kitchen counter. "You make coffee taste better." These weren't gestures meant to prove anything. They were the language of two people who had finally allowed themselves to speak the dialect they had always known but never dared use. Their friends noticed it first, not in dramatic displays but in the silences. In the way Keanu paused before answering a question about love, as if remembering something sacred. In the way Sandra glowed, not with the shine of red carpet lighting, but with the warmth of someone who had let go of holding back. One evening during a quiet gathering at a producer's house in Malibu, someone had casually asked Keanu how he was doing. He had smiled softly, not with celebrity charm, but with something older, deeper. "I'm content," he said. "For the first time, I'm living a story I don't feel the need to edit." And that was the truth, because this story, the one they were finally living, had never needed rewriting. It had simply waited. Waited through years of missed chances and silent prayers, through letters written but never sent, through interviews where smiles concealed longing, through awards won and hearts quietly breaking behind acceptance speeches, through tragedy, through time. The world continued guessing. Blogs speculated. Commentators tried to decode their every glance. But what no one seemed to understand was that their story wasn't happening in the spotlight. It was unfolding in the shadows, in the moments no one thought to watch, in the places no one thought to look. There was a Sunday when Sandra cooked him breakfast, burned eggs and all, and Keanu ate every bite without flinching, because the smell reminded him of a day on set when she had snuck into his trailer with takeout in a stolen espresso machine. There was a Wednesday when Keanu sat in Sandra's backyard reading aloud from a book neither of them remembered picking, but both swore was written for them. There were days they didn't speak, and yet somehow always knew what the other needed. There was healing, not loud, not urgent, but steady. Sandra had lost people. Keanu had lost entire pieces of himself, but in each other, they found a strange kind of sanctuary. Not a solution, not a fix, but a soft place to land. The kind of peace you don't advertise. The kind of love you don't explain. One night, as they sat on Keanu's porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Sandra turned to him. "Do you think we waited too long?" she asked. He looked at her, quiet as ever, and then took her hand. "No," he said. "We just grew into the version of ourselves that was finally ready to meet." And she believed him, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. They weren't trying to recapture youth or rewrite missed chapters. They were simply living, finally, as the people they had always been beneath the noise, and in doing so, they had rewritten something far more powerful than a love story. They had redefined it. In a rare moment of public vulnerability, Keanu later sat down for a follow-up interview, not with a reporter, but with a young filmmaker doing a student documentary on unspoken connections in Hollywood. He wasn't supposed to talk about Sandra. The project wasn't even about relationships. But something in the conversation cracked open the door. The interviewer had asked, "Do you believe there are people who are just destined to find their way back to each other?" Keanu paused, then answered, "I used to think destiny was something that happened to us. Now I think it's something we have to choose, again and again. And if you're lucky, the person you're choosing is choosing you too." The interviewer didn't press further. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over Keanu's face. As time went on, fans and tabloids moved on to fresher gossip. The noise shifted as it always does. But Keanu and Sandra, now in a rhythm all their own, remained untouched by it. They traveled together quietly, lived in two cities, shared holidays without flashing cameras. And through it all, the story they had once buried in silence began to blossom, not as fiction, but as fact. Sandra would eventually describe it best years later in a rare interview. Long after Keanu had stepped away from the screen and she had taken up more producing. "We didn't fall in love," she said. "We unfolded into it, slowly, honestly. And by the time we realized what it had already become home." And so the story no one knew wasn't one of scandal or missed romance or tragic endings. It was a story of waiting, of respecting silence, of honoring the spaces between words. It was a story about the long game of love, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, but instead asks for time, for kindness, for truth. It was about two people, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, who didn't need a spotlight to validate what they had, because what they shared didn't burn like fire. It glowed, warm, steady, and finally free.